Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the Department of Dreams Festival. And we are at the first afternoon session, and we're really, really excited about this one. This morning, we opened the day with Margaret Heffernan. She talked a lot about how you work in the age of uncertainty. What are the personal features? How do you begin and not feel completely disabled by the current context? But she also talked about what that meant at an organizational level, how experimentation and the role of experimentation is incredibly important in how we move into futures that are both, we know that are going to be hugely uncertain. We know some of the big things that are coming, but we don't know how and when they're going to come. So you might remember she talked about epidemics. We live with them all the time, but we don't know in what way they might emerge at what point. So how do you design and work within that future? And so many of you will know we've had the absolute privilege of working alongside Project 00 and then Dark Matter Labs over the last 7 years. Today, we've got a really rich 2 hours with the Dark Matter Labs team, which I feel is a real privilege given how busy they often all are. And it's as participatory as you want it to be. So you can sit back and put your feet up and just listen. You can sit and scribble notes. You can wait for the video, or you can really get involved in the chat because the team are there and they're going to be like asking you questions and asking for feedback and critique and hacking some of their ideas. So the structure of the session is for a couple of hours. It's going to be followed by a talk by Alistair Parvin, who you'll know, around a new land contract. And we're going to start off with a keynote from Indy Johar, who I'm going to introduce you in a minute. A little bit more about the thesis of the future, what he's thinking about, and what Dark Matter is kind of working towards. And then this afternoon, after Indy's talk, we're going to hear a little bit more from members of the Dark Matter Labs team, who are going to just run through some of the experiments and the ways they're thinking about how we can take a systems approach to a post-COVID recovery. They're going to run 3 sort of short micro talks and support in the chat to ask you questions. And they're going to be talking through some of the work that they've been doing around exploring alternative models of urban design around technology, nature stewardship, and indigenous property rights. Joining Indy later will be Carlotta Conte, Jonathan Lapalme, and Jack Minchella. If you look on the program from the reception area, you can download the information. You'll see all their Twitters. You'll see where they're all based because they're scattered all over the world, and you can follow some of the work behind. But for now, for many of you, Indy Johar needs no introduction. I'm certainly not going to be reading out the huge bio that he has. I'm going to tell you that he's the founding director of Dark Matter Labs. He's going to talk to you about long emergencies and the thesis behind some of the work they're doing. And I'm going to leave you in his capable hands and just slip into the backstage, and I'll be back later for your questions and to introduce some of the other micro talks from different experiment leads within Dark Matter Labs. Thanks so much for joining us, Indy, and enjoy your talk. Indy's going to share his slides, so I'll just wait here until that's all happened in an okay way.
I hope that will have happened. And thank you. Immy, is that all working?
Yeah, that's perfect. If you just there we go, perfect. Right, enjoy, put your feet back. You've got half an hour of this, and you've got time to like really sit and listen to some of the things that Indy wants. So it's not going to be a rushed session. Enjoy. Thanks, Indy.
Thank you, Immy. Thank you, everyone at the Civic Square team. It's been a real pleasure to get involved. Thank you. I suppose I want to start this conversation by the context we're in. I know many people over this festival, which has obviously been extraordinary, have been talking about this. But I think in terms of kind of building a conversation, I want to start by saying that COVID, in a way, has revealed many things. And I think it has revealed the fragility of the existing system that operates, whether it's food insecurity growing around the world, where we're seeing actually countries starting to ban exports of rice and other food groups, or places like Sweden starting to think much more strategically about what is a food risk in next year's food markets, all the way through actually the systemic injustices that have been made visible and also being accelerated. So children work in stressed households, actually a year's worth of schooling loss. What will that really mean? A year's worth of being in homes where actually there is very little space or very little sort of the intense pressure of being at home. What will that mean? So I think what we're going to see is that some of the injustices and inequalities that have been visible in our world have been will be significantly accelerated. Simultaneously, I think we're seeing a reconfiguration of our relationship between state, the thesis of markets. I mean, let's be really honest, most private companies or large corporations are now effectively state-backed. The relationship to our households, and also the relationship of civil society. I think we're seeing a reconfiguration of those realities. But also what's becoming apparent is a new type of global interdependence, a recognition of mutual vulnerability, maybe not right now in the UK, but I think globally, I think if you talk to places, whether it's places in Mongolia and other places, you very quickly realize that people are starting to recognize this thesis that these are global vulnerabilities. These cannot be dealt with at the country level alone, but they require new forms of integrated relationships. But on the bigger arc, I think it's worth recognizing that COVID is perhaps just the first of a series of shocks that we're likely to face. And it is in the face of looking into that future that I think we must start a conversation of how do we organize ourselves in an age of long emergencies? Our existing food systems, our existing corporate systems have all been designed to optimize efficiency, How do you price anti-fragility, price actually the things that we essentially need? How does a global system work in a world which is actually going to be suffering shocks? And then recognizing that COVID has not only revealed things, it's also driving a suite of cascading risks. And it's worth recognizing the scale of the catastrophe we're about to face, say, in the UK, has only just begun. And if you look at the economic kind of consequences of it, and we don't even know where the actual pandemic effects end yet. But is there a significant second wave? What does that mean? But if you look at the cascading economic effects, we're already talking about a recession that's deeper than what we saw, that any of us have seen in our lifetime, and perhaps going back to 1709. That's a Bank of England precedence. So when you start to think, and those are numbers, I get it. But I don't know, many of you were around, but 1980s recession was an absolute horrific reality where so many people lost their homes, so many people lost their jobs, families broke up, whole sorts of things occurred. So this will be a catastrophe in people's lives, not just a catastrophe in people's numbers. Whereas 2008, was a financial crash, largely dealt by financial instruments. This is something fundamentally different, and I think we're just at the beginning of that. And it's worth recognizing that if we look at this through the kind of thesis of kind of series of waves, that the fourth wave, which is the kind of scale of psychological trauma, mental illness, economic injury, burnout, these are going to be big factors. And increasingly, if you want to talk about nations that will do well, it is nations that will be able to deal with the psychological trauma and be able to address it in positive formats. Because the 21st century economy is not about how many hours we can work. It's actually about our psychological capability to actually be effective and to be creative and to be generative. And I think those things, the intangibles, and I think these are key things, the intangible health of a nation is going to be foundationally figured out in this crisis. And I think that's going to be a big issue. And this sits in a strategic issue, right? Nutrition decline that we're seeing as a result of climate change or species extinction, labor market informalization, sort of in a way, the kind of demographic dividend that we've seen around the world suddenly becoming a liability as young people can no longer get jobs and the economic futures become less and less viable. Entrenched inequality, which is accelerating. This sits on a whole fragile, not even just a fragile, a massively problematic social base. And I think one of the big challenges for us is that we have fractured our social contract into a series of economic relationships, and that the failure of our social contract is now becoming visible as we start to feel societal scale shocks. How do we deal with that? I think is going to be a real issue for the UK and many parts of the world, which have actually broken the social contract. And I think that's where we have to recognize. It's then worth recognizing that most of the things that we're talking about here are system challenges, right? So if you look into this framework, I think it's worth recognizing the nature of the problem is fundamentally different. And we've all seen system diagrams, right? Responding, these operate in different ways, their effects are different. But the reality is that, I was recently asked by somebody who said, could you give me lots of good examples on where system change is happening? And my absolute honest answer was, it's not. There's just lots of books being written and lots of pamphlets being written. Because the reality is, system change requires quite a different type of institutional infrastructure to drive it. And we still have 19th century institutions trying to think like systems, when the incentive of 19th century institutions is to optimize goals that are very much linear to them. So I think there is a real question about, we can all talk about systems change, and everyone, Immy, knows I've been waxing lyrical about this sort of diagrams for a while. This is a beastly system drawing, I think, by Patrick Valance and his team, done by the Cabinet Office. It was extraordinary. It's a brilliant piece of work. But the point of the work is, when you look at these system diagrams, and most of the problems we face are of this nature, is that it basically says there is no singular strategy. There's nobody who can write a strategy to make this change, because the actors and the agents of change are multiple and diverse and distributed. So if that's the case, how do you organize change is the question this diagram should ask us. And that's a real issue. So if we're living in an age of complexity and we're living in an age of shocks, how do we organize for an age of complexity becomes a real fundamental question. And I think the challenges we face is that we no longer know. We are struggling to be able to respond to that thesis. So in the middle of a crisis, governments got rid of the thesis of budgets, and they got rid of the thesis of accountability, and they were moving to get things done at rapid space. Largely, we've seen command and control systems being made effective and delivered as much as they could be done, with some amount of collaboration. But complexity and dealing with complexity requires a different model, and we need to deal with complexity at speed, and that requires a whole different bunch of features. And I think that really has to be understood. So the purpose of these diagrams is not to make you sit and look godlike at the world. The purpose of these diagrams is to show why the godlike view on this system diagram is fundamentally a problem, and we need a different way of organizing. And this applies to sort of any of these things. This is a brilliant talk you're going to get from Alistair Parvin, his work around actually looking at the how house prices and how housing supply is a knotted problem. And this applies to many of the issues that we think are simplistic and people love to deploy simple solutions to. People keep saying that, I will say it, people say, we've got a housing shortage. How do we solve the housing shortage? Well, we need to build more. They say, okay, how are you going to build more? Well, we'll subsidize, construction partners. When and architects then tend to come forward and say, we can make the house a little bit cheaper by putting it into containers, or we can make the house 2% cheaper by doing offsite construction, or 5% cheaper, or 10% cheaper. But actually what they're not dealing with is the underlying issue is not even the construction cost of the house, but the price of land. And Alistair will give you a full verse and thesis on this, which I really recommend as well. So the nature of these problems is different. And the nature of the problems that these systems are causing is fundamentally different. The creation of runaway causal loops, which is what we're seeing, externalities which are pouring in, micro pollutions, whether it's at the level of kind of memetics, or whether it's a level of plastics, or whether it's a level of noise, or whether it's a level of light pollution. These things, these micro interventions into our system, systematically destroying the commons that is essential, is, I think, going to become one of the big issues. Short-term optimization and competitive decision-making. These are some of the things that are defining the features in our current system. And again, this was when you start to take a systems view, you start to look at the kind of complexity of the problem. This was work done with our friends at Civic, looking at the thesis of radical childcare. And what became very evident is when you take a view of how do you improve children's outcomes, it is not a problem of education. It is not just a problem of education, it's a problem of a whole bunch of factorials which go all the way back into how we create stress and poverty, systemic poverty, and systemic stress, and systemic financial insecurity in the lives of parents. So if we have created an economy which is fundamentally about driving precariousness, you've created structural vulnerability into the household and thereby actually undermine the household's capability to actually operationalize. And that, I think, has been an economic thesis of our age, which is to create that psychological structural vulnerability. It used to be called labor market agility, but I would reframe it, it's about vulnerability. And how do we make people vulnerable and thereby incentivize them with a thing called wages? But at the moment, the implications of that are structural. They have implications, externalities, which are to do with that vulnerability, the stress that it generates, a whole bunch of financial precariousness that it generates, what that does in terms of cognitive performance of the child, the aggression that exists in the household. We know actually domestic violence in the West Midlands region has massively gone up over the last few months. So as the economic and human stresses increase, the effects on children will be significant, all the way through to the nature of how we teach, all the way through to curriculum, all the way through to outdoor time, all the way through to the notion of how do you induce care, not teaching, because we know care is more fundamental. So if you want to deal with these complex systems, you have to look at some of these underlying infrastructures. And you have to get beyond magic bullets, right? Again, this is building straight out of the radical childcare work that was done. You start to recognize that these aren't solutions that can be fixed by any one agent, but they require a multiplicity of interventions at speed. Let me go back to that thesis. We need to solve things at speed. And that becomes really, really critical. So in the COVID crisis, what we're seeing is the fiscal capability of central government is massively centralizing capability. So what we're seeing is central government recruit people, grow bigger, all the fiscal rules and programs are being designed centrally. At the same time, we know actually innovation or the response, the integrated appropriate response will have to be hyper-contextual. So what we're seeing, and we're going to see this massive centralization, if governments fail to be able to decentralize the capability for communities to be able to respond appropriate to their context, we will see a failure of investment and a failure of programs, because that's where we're currently lying. So to deal with complexity in this age of shocks requires new ways of operationalizing. And it requires new portfolios. And everyone's been talking about portfolios. It's now one of the key words that is used. But when we start to think about portfolios, they require a theory of change and organizing, which is fundamentally different. How do you have 40 different people innovating? How do you support 40 different people innovating to a shared mission and aims? How do you support shared learning of those 40 different organizations and institutions innovating? How do you build shared incentive mechanisms around those 40 people innovating? And how do you measure shared outcomes? What does shared accountability look like? So behind this stuff sits an institutional infrastructure which has to be fundamentally different to manifest this reality. And that requires new ways of organizing. Again, that requires new ways of thinking about how do we do inquiry. This is not about even 40 people organizing, but it's actually about how do you build a public movement? And I think the thesis of how do you build shared consensus? Because one of the other big challenges we face is that unless you can build a shared thesis or a shared view on the world, a shared sense making of how we see the world, unless that is truly shared, your solutions will never be legitimate. So the construction of that a shared perspective is vital. And the kind of thesis of how you construct an open inquiry, where you build the collective shared sense making of the world, is a vital, vital issue. And I would argue that our sense making infrastructure is largely broken. And it's not about you and me being able to make a systems map. That is not sense making. And it's certainly not legitimate sense making. And it's certainly not sense making for everyone involved. So the question is, how do you build that capacity is a really, really critical thing. And then you also have to build, this is often ignored because systems change tend to be focused on what I'd call cultural transformation, but actually underneath it are all the incentive mechanisms, the governance mechanisms, the finance mechanisms, the accounting mechanisms. All these things have to be actually transformed to be able to unlock the capacity for distributed, decentralized innovation. And then there's another layer. How do you invest into this reality? And most of kind of social finance theory thus far is nowhere near ready to actually do systems investment. Everyone talks systems investment, but actually, are they able to invest in 40 different interventions at the same time with shared outcomes and looking at the virtuous outcomes those things drive? No. Yet most of our social investment theory is still based on actually a corporate venture capital model, which is you invest in one entity and hope it brings you back the returns. Yet we know social goods and social missions don't operationalize that way. So this requires us to transform not only the culture and the kind of perception of change, all the way to the institutional infrastructures of it. And I think that's my key point here. At the same time, I think it's critical that we start to think that this goes beyond the kind of methods and processes of organizing to also some of the deep codes. And this is where I want to take the conversation for a few minutes. What I mean by deep codes is that it's clear that I would argue, and I think a lot of the work that DM has been doing and others would argue that the externalities that we face, that we're seeing, whether it's future liabilities or the destruction of common resources, whether it's chronic illnesses, loneliness, heat island effects, soil degradation, antibacterial resistance, all these things that we're seeing manifest in our city, and many others, right? Social injustices, all of these things are structured as a result of deep code errors. They're not just problems of organizing. They're actually problems at the level, at the root and branch of how we perceive ourselves in the world, how we understand our relationship to the world. And that, I think, is a really key issue. And how we see, and what do I mean by deep code errors? I mean the thesis of property rights. I mean the thesis of what is a contract. I mean the thesis of accounting. These things have been optimized for a worldview which was about a worldview which was perceptibly infinite, but actually, and thereby focused on silos, i.e., a object, a thesis, a point of value, as opposed to the interdependence. It was all operationalized to a thesis of control and competition. So property rights is a thesis of control. I control that piece of land. I have sovereignty on that piece of land and the benefits that that land yields. It's not a relationship with land. It's certainly not a relationship to land to optimize the well-being of that land and my well-being. It's a resource-based relationship. And it can be manifest, and Carlotta will talk about later, in our thesis with trees. We see our trees as a resource and a liability. We do not see it. We see the value of trees. We don't see the environmental services value. We don't account for it. We don't see the intangible assets of our societies and economies. So these deep code errors are fundamental to addressing some of the system change challenges that we place on the table. And I would like to argue that I think the great revolution that we're in the middle of is at a technological level. I think things like Uber, things like all these things are not technological revolutions, they're bureaucratic revolutions. So I call them boring. They are things of how we measure, how we contract, how we govern, how we structure. They're about transforming our information system. And that is the revolution that's going on, because what Uber did was basically, it's just a taxi company, right? Let's not over glamorize it. The taxi company, it basically disintermediated the taxi office. It was able to process and re-engineer it. So the reinvention of bureaucracy is the age we're in. And I think it's a really critical point. So when the Kaiser built our current thesis of bureaucracy, it was constructed through a thesis of control and military. I think one of the big revolutions we're in the middle of is that our bureaucratic systems are no longer able to handle the complexity of the world. So the overhead of governance and the overhead of bureaucracy is becoming larger and larger or failing. At the same time, we have new technological capability, which is able to revolutionize our thesis on bureaucracy, but we haven't built the institutional capability or the institutional infrastructures built to deal with it. So this revolution and bureaucracy, and is that revolution a thesis, an extension of control, or is it an extension of how we ennoble ourselves and the thesis of ennoblement, i.e., how does our thesis of bureaucracy and governance not be about controlling, but helping us being better humans and better humans in our relationship with the world? So these deep codes are going to be fundamental. And I think one of the big works from DM's perspective has been really focusing on these things. We were obviously I was co-founded with David Saxby, 00, and many of us were involved in building various things, Open Desk, WikiHouse, and all these sort of organizations. many impact hubs as well. But one of the things we started to realize that underneath them all, the failure was at this bureaucratic level. Unless we could do this, those things would never really manifest true form. They could never achieve what they were meant to achieve. No social investment fund could achieve what it was trying to achieve because they were operationalized, fundamentally misoperationalized. And when we start to look at this, I would say, looking forward, what that means is that any meaningful agenda, I think, is going to have to operationalize in these kind of 5 dimensions. It's going to have to be focused on prevention. And prevention is not an easy task because most of, like I was saying, our public accounting mechanisms don't account for prevention. They don't account for future liabilities. Insurance companies do. They make provisions for future liabilities, which is why in 1666, and when the insurance company was born after the Great Fire of London, actually they were the ones that built the fire brigade service. They were the ones that set foot that actually it was better to hire people who would go out and put out the fire rather than wait for the buildings to burn down and pay a premium. So the thesis of prevention is a legal construct which you have to do is crystallize future risks. When you can crystallize those future risks, you can then drive prevention. So in order to drive a prevention agenda, we're going to have to start to look at that. And that will only work for things where risks are crystallizable. In an age of uncertainty, that is only a dimension of our problem, right? This is really important. Second is, and this is sort of, I'll bring this here. When you can't, for the risk that you can't deal with, you have to build, I would argue, and many other people would argue, systemic anti-fragility. You have to build the capacity for actually agents to be able to absorb shocks and grow with them. So shocks don't destroy them. That's about distribution of wealth. That's all about universal basic income. It's about building the systemic capacity to absorb shocks. That's psychological level, monetary level, but also the ability to how you operationalize in the world and the vulnerabilities that we exist in. So those things are really critical. There's some things that work for crystallizable risks, some things that don't work for that. Then I think we have to start to think about the future tasks. Where do we want that prevention to happen? And where do you want to stop it? And sometimes you can do prevention in settings. Sometimes you can do preventions by settings. I mean, built environment and the biases that we create in that. Sometimes you can do prevention at the case of human to human interaction. Sometimes you can do it the prevention with almost machine interaction. We know that actually, bizarrely enough, AI assisted chat rooms have been really powerful for people who are suffering from loneliness issues. So we have to start to think, where do you want to shift these future tasks? And that's a key issue. Third is the co-benefits economy, which is recognizing that increasingly it's not about one thing does one benefit. It's about how one thing does multiple benefits. And this is a fundamental problem for government, which designs single aspect programs. How do you design something which has large, significant spillover effects? And a tree is not just a value of its aesthetic, it's a value of its capability to support sustainable urban drainage, address heat island effects, the various other benefits off the back of it. So it's multiple benefits of a system. How do you build a system for a multi-benefit economy? What aspect of that economy can be machined? What aspect of that economy should be gift? What aspect of the economy should be highly human and transactional? And how do you start to think about that? That's really key. Obviously, the systems work that we know, but also how we measure. And I think it's really important that we think of measurement not as a thesis of control, but as a thesis for learning. And if we're going to adopt this model, we have to shift the thesis from control to learning at a structural level. And that's, in a way, what does procurement look like, which is about learning and doing, as opposed to learning and control. So we have to really start to underpin this thesis. Here, I'm going to go into what I think some of the kind of grand challenges are. I'm nearly coming to an end, so hopefully you've been patient with me. I think what I'd like to say is that everything I've said till now, I think, is setting some of the sort of core issues. However, I do not think it's enough to get us. Risk management will not be enough to deal with the scale of challenges that we're dealing with. We are going to have to look at the generator functions, i.e., where these risks are being born, and reimagine our relationships at the source of these risks. And that, I think, is the real Horizon 3 work. Because without doing that, these risks will carry on persisting and come back with us in bigger and larger formats, and in other words. And I would say that these are the four dimensions that I think we're going to have to resolve. The thesis of how we relate individually as humans to humans, I think our thesis of human to human relationship is still a thesis of control. It's still employment is largely a control thesis. It's not a really emancipation thesis yet. And I think we're working significantly to do that. How do we transform our societies built for human development and becoming, I would say, not even being, human becoming? How do you build societies which are focused on humans as agents of discovery when actually procedural work, procedural economies are increasingly automated? How do you deal with economies of care in that thesis? So there's a whole reimagination of what human development looks like in the 21st century, which isn't just about sort of the code, but it's about the new emancipation that lies at the center of this transition. And I think we have not even begun talking about that in the real way. Our relationship with nature, I think, is, Jonathan Lapalme will talk a little bit about this, and I hope is an amazing speaker as well. And you will hear some really good stuff about our relationship with nature, our relationship with transforming it, not from a resource thesis, but actually in other formats. Embracing societies, embracing stewardship, which is actually our thesis of how we own things and what our thesis of ownership looks like and new ways of imagining that. And Jack Minchella, I'm sure, will build on some of these things. And then our relationship with the future. Our relationship with the future is two ways. It's our relationship to how we impact the future and future citizens, but also how the future is going to impact us. Those relationships are fundamentally broken. I'm sure many speakers will have said, lots of people talked about the pandemic, but our ability to deal with the future and the risks that it poses, whether it's climate change, is evidently systemic failure in play. And reimagining that relationship is going to be critical. So this is pretty much my last slide, so I'm sure Immy's getting really tired by now. But what I would like to say is that if we look forward into this transition and these four dimensions, I think what's very key is that if we're going to deal with the scale of change that's necessary, yes, we're going to have to deal with the deep code stuff I spoke about, property rights, all these structure stuff. We're also going to have to deal with legacy lock-ins, the lock-ins which are, yes, carbon assets, but also trauma, massive historic injustices. We will not be able to create a new social contract, which is an integrated social contract, without dealing with those historic injustices and those lock-ins. We are going to have to challenge our perception of self. Who are we? Our thesis of being human is fundamentally outdated. It's still lying in the 1960s, locked into words like meritocracy, locked into words about control and management. All this thesis is based on actually incentives. Homo economists, I'm sure Kate spoke very eloquently about that. The thesis of self is fundamentally broken, and it's not even in tune with the speed and the scale of what science is telling us we're about. And then our thesis of organizing. How do we organize ourselves in society? How do we organize ourselves in society when we know that if somebody gives up the will to live, they will die within 3 days? When the giving up the will to live is a matter of actually letting go of life is so real. Does democracy then really mean building a capacity to unleash our wills? Does freedom really mean not a freedom to escape, but a freedom to care? Our ability to and our need to reorganize the language and the thesis of this stuff is critical. That goes all the way through to challenging language like markets, which has become everyday parlance. What is a market? Most of the things that we operate and consume into are not operating like markets at all. So we have to reframe the languages and taxonomies that are describing our world to allow us to reimagine it. So what I would say here is that if we're going to make this transition, it is going to require reorganizing in a systems way, dealing with the deep codes, dealing with our legacy lock-ins, but simultaneously a transformation of self and how we perceive ourselves. And I think that only in a together format can we then deal with the four structural issues: our relationship with nature, our relationship with the future, our relationship with things, and our relationship with being human. So with that, I'll pause and come back to stage.
Thank you so much for that. I'm not going to get into into questions, because we could go for days with that. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that help us transition into the new. So over the years, I've really heard a lot of people say to you, okay, Indy, these theses that you put out, right? Like, what do we do with it tomorrow? Like, I need to sell it to my my MP or my government, and you've resisted so much of that because you've talked about what it means to build organizations that can experiment, that can emerge into this future. Can you talk to us a little bit about, and you've talked about the fact that, in very few places you've actually seen systemic change happening in a way that is rising to the order of the challenge. It's often quite cultural, and it's often a lot about theory and writing about this phenomenon. So talk to me a little bit about Margaret talked this morning about experimentation. She talked about it both at an individual level and at an organizational level. And I kind of sort of said that this afternoon we're going to hear about an organization that's been growing in that way. So can you tell us a little bit about your thinking behind building dark matter, the way you work, and why are we going to hear from a bunch of different experiments and different people? Just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I think for me, well, several things. One, I would say that I think it's increasingly challenging to talk about experiments. That's what I would start with, which is that I think the reality is that as the world becomes increasingly difficult, we are no longer going to be talking about experiments, but experimenting as we're making large-scale change. And so I think that's a fundamentally different thing. The reality is we're going to have to roll out things when we are pre-factual. We don't know the facts. We don't know the evidence. And it's our ability to construct legitimacy and evidence and be agile and responsive to driving change at scale that's going to be the only viable response. I think the kind of language of let's have an experiment, let's figure out the evidence and roll it out, it's gone. We just don't have the time. We no longer have the patience. I think there's real people at the end of this story so I don't think we have that capacity. So I think we're operating now in another horizon on that, which is experiment will be the way of operating. It is no longer a thesis that you spend 6 years building evidence and everything else. I think we'll be operating a different way. And that takes time. That's a very different organization. That's what I mean. Operating an organization into that reality is really challenging because you suddenly have to be very agile. It puts huge psychological pressures, I think, on organizations when you're operating that way. You have to operate with uncertainty in a kind of lived sense. So I think there's a really interesting question about how do you build organizations to do that? I don't think we've done that yet successfully, right? Let me be honest with that. I'm not in any way going to say that. And I think if I did, I think Jonathan would probably sort of kill me later. So I think we're trying to figure it out, but I think that's the challenge, certainly. And I think also what's worth recognizing is over this period, I think everyone's becoming more psychologically vulnerable, right? And this work requires so much care, attention, and psychological support. It's not just technical doing. It's actually the freedom to think when our lives become more precarious, more vulnerable, which is what we're going to see. So I think, how do you provide that psychological grounding? How do you provide that inclusive capability? How do you build the kind of trust in the infrastructure when people are more and more separated out into their homes? I think these are really fundamental questions. But what they do throw up is that there is no way any single person can drive this. There is no way a centralized organization can drive this. That's why, I'm just one person at DM. There's a whole team of people, extraordinary leaders that are building this stuff. Same way you built Civic Square, right? So it requires a completely different thesis of support, and you have to recognize it's only through a vast team of leadership. Jack has been doing extraordinary work in reorganizing DM into missions. So we're organized into a series of missions into that thesis. And building off that, where we operationalize projects in different ways. Our contracts, we're trying to move into different formats so they're not They're not in any way consulting their mission contracts. So it requires you to, one of the things that we tried out, which hasn't really stuck, but I think is really important yet, is language of not being task orientated, but being discovery orientated. So it's also in the small words that we use with each other, right? Of what tasks have you got today, or what are you going to learn? What are you going to discover? Those small words set up precedents and patterns. At the same time, it's practical things. How do you build cash flow in an organization like this? How do you deal with, the reality of it, though, which is worth not lying about, right? In a kind of age with precariousness and everything else, how do you build that cash flow? How do you build, large organizations don't have to worry about it, so you're always in this asymmetry of power. How do you drive that? So I think it's not easy, really not easy. But the tension is you're working in all these asymmetries of power, and somehow you've got to keep that thesis of kind of inclusive leadership and distributed agency at the center of it, because there's no one person that's smart enough. This requires complex synthesis of capabilities between finance, technology, design, politics, agency, entrepreneurship. It requires a whole bunch of capabilities to come together to build this, if we're going to build it.
Thanks so much, Indy. We're going to obviously hear from some of the projects within some of the mission areas within Dark Matter shortly. But this before we finish with you, Indy, and guys, Indy will be around in the chat, and we'll respond to bits and bobs. And if there's a chance everyone can come back on stage later, we'll try. But it wasn't in the plan, so I'm not going to promise that. There's a couple of things I want to. There's loads of great questions coming in. I want to say first and foremost, Indy will do some chatting in the stage chat. Secondly, check out the Dark Matter website, because there's a lot of stuff on there that is ready, that they're happy to be open, because it's in a way ready for that. Check out the mediums and the provocations. There's lots of writing and talks and work around this, in all sorts of places, as well as obviously trying to get Indy's sides and asking him everything. Indy, we've had a really it's been a really warm, beautiful few days in the festival so far. All sorts of different ideas at different scales and different types of thinking. People have been really interested in and really responded to stuff really well. One of the things that's been a nice unexpected thread is, we've just been talking to different contributors about, and Anna brought this up really well yesterday. She gave us, Anna Jane, who I know you know well, gave an incredible talk about literally viscerally and embodying the future, and then figuring out what that's like. And we ended up rolling into a conversation about, well, what does that mean for your son? Does he live perpetually in the future and anxiety with you? How do you manage all of this? And she went on to talk about how she doesn't have any magic bullet with all the answers. She's not suddenly, because she's a futurist and does it in a really embodied, visceral way, she doesn't know what's coming or how we're going to deal with it. She has to pay her bills and deal with cash flow and make sure the mortgage is paid, and make sure her son is both playful and enjoying the future, as well as learning the skills that he might need. And I wonder, and she talked about this second order effect, almost like when you can see what's coming, and when that everything we're doing is not quite enough all the time, that's something that she really struggles with. So, Indy, the man, the individual, the personal, if you can sort of see the amount of crises that are going to multiply hit us in different ways over the next couple of years, and so many of our responses, especially in this country, as Matthew Taylor just said in the talk before you, being so inadequate, how do you deal with this? And honestly, I appreciate your honesty in the organisation bit as well. What's going on? Lots of people look to you for answers. How do you deal with that, and how do you sort of work through all of that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the way I really struggle. I really struggle with not that I say I can see it, but it's pretty evident to me what the scale of what we're about to witness. I struggle at the personal level because I feel like there's we can all think about, get up and leave or whatever, do something else or whatever, any of these things. But you start to realize that you can make rational individual decisions, right? Rational individual homo economist decisions. but I think they are fundamentally different from rational moral decisions, i.e., what is the right thing to do? What is the right thing to do in terms of actually your contribution to a system? And that's the part I really struggle with. I think, especially when you can see it, right? When you can see the world as it's playing out, we're in a really dire place and it's going to get much worse. Like, and I'm not saying in a year's time, I'm saying in months' time. In 3 to 4 months, it's going to get much worse. And you'll see it in everyday affairs, everyday violence, everyday aggression, every day. You'll see the tone of the world change, right? Those tone has significant impacts. I've already talked about the micro-violence, but I think you'll see everyday aggression increase if you're if you're any different person, right? If you're any form of difference will be used as a mechanism for aggression. We'll see all sorts of difficulties. So when you can see it, do you turn around and just say, right, you know what, I can just move to X and leave? Or do you actually sort of bury in and kind of go, right, there's a moral responsibility to contribute? And I have to admit, I find that really difficult. And when you can see a pathway, but you know that if you take the pathway, who are you then? If you take that pathway, what have you done to your moral responsibility to actually to the system and the place that you were part of and contribute to? So I think that's one of the challenges I really face. And I think personally, I also, I think it does put you, when you can see it, I work all sorts of hours, crazy hours, because actually I just know what's coming. And I was around in the 80s. I saw things happen. I saw, my dad lose his job. I saw what happened when that happens. We were living in a 2-room apartment. I saw these things, right? I saw working in a video shop. I saw that stuff, and I know what that means. And I'm not even sure I know what it means when it's a 300-year recession. So when you take it to that level, and that's the part I worry about. I don't think we're being real with ourselves at the scale of what's coming. At the same time, the scale of change that's needed. And then the other problem is, I don't think we're organizing power. I don't think any of us are organizing power yet to make the scale of change that's necessary. And that's really important that we start to organize power. And I think it's really great to see leadership, the kind of convening that you've done, and the scope and scale of that leadership that you're bringing on the table. I think we have to match that with power as well, because it's going to be necessary.
Thanks, Indy, and thanks for bringing, Indy, the personal side. I feel like I get to see some of that, and I often know that out in the world, it's just this real experience of people working in this space is not often explored much. I remember a couple of years ago when we were in Seattle, and we asked a similar question of Conte Mason, an incredible founder of the previous Impact Hub Oakland, but many, many other things. She said, well, it's just harder not to do the work. And I guess you've also spoken to that, right? Like, she didn't even need to give a long answer about what inspires her. It was kind of like, yeah, it's just hard. It's too hard not to. And I guess you talk about that constant, like, which path am I taking if I can see that the future is it has all these different things. But before this turns into an Indy and Immy like sobbing into the camera about how to build cash flow and survive these crazy times, I have to say that one of the great things about Dark Matter and what I've been really incredibly inspired by is the consistent work over the last 4 or 5 years to build out different missions and experiments and get on with it. And we're going to hear from some of those now this afternoon. And what's going to happen is Indy will go off screen now for a bit, but he's there in the background. He'll be able to chat, and we might bring him back later. As he goes off the screen, I'm going to welcome on Jonathan Lapalme, who's going to talk to you about the first area of work and experimentation and mission area soon. So yeah, Indy, if you can say bye. Thank you so much for the talk and for the honesty. And soon, in a miracle on the main stage, I feel like I'm hosting my own TV show here. So in a second, there we go. Perfect. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
That was seamless, wasn't it? Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, right. Jonathan is going to be with you for the next sort of 20 minutes or so, and he's going to talk through one of the areas of the work that Indy started to talk about. I actually, Jonathan is not based in the UK, and we sort of in the digital sphere share lots of appreciation for the work. But I'm really excited to hear from Jonathan and his work around property. Right. And the thing I'd say is that, like I said before, Jonathan will talk and we'll keep it moving, and we'll try and keep the questions being replied to in the chat. And if a time comes where I can bring you all back on for a lovely, like this morning style on the sofa with everyone from DML, I will definitely try that, right? But we don't know for definite if we can do that. So please keep asking your questions as you go, because that would be great. But I am going to try that. We're trying to budge Alistair back half an hour as well, because you're all so excited. I've never seen so many comments flying into the chat. So this is brilliant. Right, Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. Jonathan's going to share his screen and start his talk. And as he does, I'll step into the background.
Okay, can you tell me if this is working?
Yeah, I will do. Perfect, that's working. Right, enjoy. I'll see you shortly, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Okay. So, bonjour tout le monde. I'm speaking from Montreal, situated on unceded indigenous lands. It was known as Johar as a meeting place for a lot of First Nations before European settlers. So property as a micro-treaty, rethinking our responsibilities towards nature through land ownership. We put land ownership here, but I guess what we're moving towards in this presentation is stewardship of the land. For some of you who might not be too familiar with the history in Canada, there was a statement in the Truth and Reconciliation Act with Indigenous people that was done in 2015, and that quote I think is central, which is that reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians from an Aboriginal perspective also requires reconciliation with the natural world. If human beings resolve problems between themselves but continue to destroy the natural world, then reconciliation remains incomplete. And so that's what we will explore today. I'd like to acknowledge that when engaging with this work as non-Indigenous people, we had to be very careful. We ran a lot of different workshops with different Indigenous people across Canada, sustained relationships with them over more than a year. Satsan from the Center for First Nations Governance, John Burrows from the University of Victoria, Melissa Manin-Dupri from the David Suzuki Foundation, and many others. The work was really informed by them. And so, as Indy mentioned in a different way, I guess, we're all living under self-terminating paradigms. On the Indigenous side, racist policies like the Indian Act, a history of genocide, but also our problematic relationship with nature. And as we saw, I think with COVID-19, the emergence of that pandemic was also linked to our destruction of ecosystems. And so it is central to how we rethink who we are as humans and how we interact with other species in the future. This is a map of Indigenous nations before Europeans settled. And so all these Indigenous peoples were in a way governed, had their own governance systems and laws and stories that were dictating a little bit how they operated. And these ancestral ways are doing a resurgence at the moment, and have been for a while, towards more self-determination and reintegrating more explicitly some Indigenous knowledges. And so what we've been trying to work with Civic Indigenous 7.0 is, on the right side, decentering Western defaults of thinking, often based on the primacy of the self, on universalism, and finding a way to reconnect and develop a middle way through multi-eyed seeing methodologies. And at some point, I think we were hoping for this kind of perfect symbiosis in between. But as the two-row wampum agreement that was made with one First Nation through a belt In some ways, respect is also about moving side by side in our boats and realizing that that middle space is a space of love that we need to respect and not necessarily hitting each other with our canoes. And so through all this work, we have formulated 7 points of convergence, which can be summarized, I think, through all my relations and making kin. I will go into details with some of them later, but verbs, not nouns, I think maybe is one of the most surprising to me that, we describe a lot of our problematic relationship with nature. But if you look at the composition of the English language, for instance, there's a minority of verbs. I think it's 20% or something verbs. In some indigenous languages like Ojibwe, it's up to 80% verbs. And so in the language of Potawatomi, for instance, as expressed in the book Braiding Sweet Grass, when we talk about a bay, like with water, it's to be a bay. It's not a bay as an object. It's to be a bay as a process and as a living process. And so it's important, I think, to recognize that the objectifying nature of language, of the English language, also influences how we see the world and continue to see the world. And so as part of, we're working with the McConnell Foundation for the past year. And so on this, our initial starting point was how to rethink property rights and environmental protection at the intersection of civic and indigenous futures in order to address the multiple crises of our times, whether it's global climate, housing prices, and how it all relates to our broken relationship to land. And so, as part of this, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we need to kind of stay with the trouble. This conversation will keep evolving. There's no clear solutions. It's a dialogue and a conversation that keeps on evolving and will continue to do so. And it's a very deep and difficult work to do. And the dialogue between indigenous resurgence and decentered Western perspective must acknowledge the presence of deeply contrasting life worlds. One Cree Mohawk woman from Edmonton told us at some point, like, if I arrive at the table of negotiation and for me, water is my relative and for you, water is something to put in water bottles to sell, how can we have a conversation without making visible all the background story of that belief? And so it's important to recognize that all law is storied. Often it's much more explicit in some indigenous cultures. What is that story that we're telling about who we are and our relationship to nature? But even if we sometimes like to pretend that our constitutions and legal traditions are quite objective and neutral, they also come from certain roots that are telling us a story about who we are and how we interact with the world and a certain worldview. And so as we engage with that work, it's really important to make explicit all those different stories to better engage with some of the roots behind it and how a lot of environmental laws are about, the dominion of the humans over the earth, and that maybe it's time to change that story. And so what is beneath that story of Western law? Some observations that if you're not right-bearing, you are owned. Ownership is expressed through written contracts between sovereign and autonomous humans, where land is often absent. I'm not pronouncing that right, sorry. English is my second language. Earth is in the background against which humans live out history. And if you look at, for instance, all the laws, regulations, and normative acts of the Minister of the Environment in Quebec, you can see that land is either understood as passive, silent, or fragile. So at best, though at worst, we're extracting it, abusing it. At best, we're protecting it and keeping it out of the touch of humans. But it's not necessarily embodying a dynamic relationship and collaboration with nature between humans and other species. And so if you look at, so in Canada, you have like indigenous legal traditions, common law, civil law in Quebec because of the French influence. And so there's different legal traditions. But in common law, we're talking a lot about bundle of rights, right? Possession, control, exclusion, enjoyment, and dispossession. Land is understood as abstract and dephysicalized. And it's quite similar to civil law. the right to give, sell, neglect, destroy. It's almost surprising at like how explicit it all is, right? Right to use freely, right to make profits. And in both legal traditions, it's about a bundle of rights. And one of the things that Satsan, a hereditary chief from the Wet'suwet'en nation that we worked with, was telling us often is that for us, property is a bundle of responsibilities, not a bundle of rights. And so that raises a lot of questions and recognizes that making of a passive, abstract, dephysicalized, and absent land is a function of colonialism, the same way that we had to dehumanize certain groups of people based on their skin color to be able to abuse them. It's the same thing that we do a little bit with the land. And, you know, we love the word post. I feel these days, like post-consumption, post-COVID, post-growth, post-this, post-that, post-capitalism. And often it's kind of an expression of creating a state of nature fiction that de-emphasize or deny the past complex entanglements. And so we need, I think, to review that, because no matter what project you do on in a certain area, there's a history, a natural history, a human history. Like, you never can free yourself completely with the entanglement of the past. And so making land present in law is a matter of deep reconciliation. And so how am I on time? I think it's been a bit more than 10 minutes, so maybe I'll accelerate. We looked at like some traditions that were decentering a little bit property rights and environmental law from a Western perspective. You have rights of nature, you know, giving rights to a specific like river or lake and so on. It's been emerging a lot in the past few decades. Some indigenous people that we talked to were quite like not suspicious, but critical about it. Some of the things we were told is, why just a river? Where does the river end? On our territory, everything has rights, not just a river. Also, because for rights of nature, you need to have someone representing the interest of that piece of land or that piece of ecosystem in the courts. It relies a lot on land defenders who are being murdered all around the world a lot these days, and increasingly so. Communal land trusts, we talked about how property is about relationship from people, person to person or people to people. Here, the land is present in that contract, but it's mostly for affordability often, depending on the type of communal land trust, but it's not necessarily for other species and not for non-humans. And we often think about property rights as absolute, right? We saw it in the critiques of like looting in the US and with protests. Like, we believe in that story so much, but we already have a lot of layers of responsibilities. Like, you have the private property title, which in Canada is protected under provincial law, but you have municipal laws that has all kinds of responsibilities linked to it. You have provincial laws, you have federal laws, you have constitutional law, and actually the Aboriginal title is now protected at a higher level than property rights. And then you have Indigenous law, which consists in all the legal orders rooted in Indigenous societies themselves. And so some of the questions right now in Canada is, what does Aboriginal title mean for private property? Will it oust privately held beneficial interest in land, or will privately owned land prevent declarations of Aboriginal title over such lands? And so that's a story that is yet to be written, because the recognition of it under the Constitution is quite recent. But there's a recognition that we need to renew our legal relationship to land, as much for our reconciliation with Indigenous people as for addressing the climate crisis. And so we looked into some proofs of possibilities, which is actually a term I think that was coined by the Turtle Island Institute. Because when we approached some Indigenous people with the word experiment, it was deemed really problematic because they have been experimented on enough. And so that word was seen as very problematic, and so we changed it. One of the projects we're working on concretely is Nouveau Voisin, working on the regeneration of lawns, changing the culture of manicured green lawns to make room for more biodiversity and mitigate some of the effects of climate change, but also change our relationship with nature, putting it as a gesture of reconciliation that starts in our backyards. And so for us, or for me at least, I'll have to say that this civic indigenous work is more and more the governing terrain on which to rethink approaches to regulation and capital and all the different layers of our work. And so we used the 7 points of convergence that emerged with all our conversations with indigenous people as kind of a compass in action. So for this project, we went through a series of questions to kind of make sure that we embedded and took into consideration all those different aspects. From on the bottom right, like high-tech, traditional ecological knowledge around indigenous innovation and knowledge. I won't go through the questions because I think time is running fast. Time is not running fast, but I'm taking more time than I thought. So how to collectively redefine beauty to value function. We've seen it, like just in recent weeks, we posted No Mow May, like a campaign to stop people from mowing their lawn in May so that to leave more nectar for endangered pollinators. And it was one of the most viral posts we've ever had. You can see that people are ready to take action and change their approach to how they see how their land serves not only them, but other species. We often like to talk about 50-50, never take more than half, always leave some for others. And the nouveau voisin in English means new neighbors, which is about extending the notion of neighborhood to other species, not only humans. We started drafting with Carlotta and others a co-benefit map of all the different actions that could be taken in our yards and how we can measure it to make sure that we take into consideration all my relations, recognizing that all my relations is kind of a spiritual indigenous principle that through now different types of knowledges, I think we're connecting back to and recognizing with different tools to take them into consideration, whether it's with a mixture of like citizen science and remote sensing, as Indy, I think, mentioned a little bit. And so if it's true that we already have different legal orders in which to weave responsibilities towards nature, we can think about how to change some of them. So for instance, at the municipal level, we literally have some rules that say that you cannot have a cover of your yard that is more than a certain number of centimeters. And we actually know an indigenous person who had someone from the city coming to his yard with a ruler saying, this is too high. And so he told him who he was, and the bureaucrat left immediately. But this is kind of the regulatory apparatus we have at the moment. But we could change that to make sure that 50% of our yards are dedicated to other species, for instance. And we've seen examples with heritage laws where rights of nature are included into a conservation easement to recognize the rights of nature on a certain property. And so we have to clean our house first in a way as indigenous people and First Nations are working on their resurgence. We need to kind of clear out a little bit and redefine what stories we're telling in our regulations. Of course, it's not just about written regulations. It's about, social norms, how we interact, market laws. And so we're working on how to transition from a loose, like a common and control approach, as I've just described with like ruler and like how high your grass is, to decentralized accountability and how to ennoble not just people, but other species as well. It has implications at the individual yard level, but if we move it to this neighborhood scale with ecological corridors, or at the city scale or at the regional scale, it opens up a lot of different possibilities. So for instance, we know that monarch's butterfly are endangered because we're treating one of the plant they rely on as weed, and we just like, weed is the term, like we just remove it automatically. But how, if we're all connected and ready to counsel with nature and act collectively to face certain extinctions, maybe we could all decide collectively to plant certain things in our yards that would support together some species that are endangered. And so how to rethink the platforms of decentralized accountability where we act together along those lines. And can we go even further in questioning our notion of land ownership and reconciliation? Can we think of property as entering into a treaty with the place, entering into relationship with the place rather than owning it? As we saw, property rights are not absolute. They're a story that is so ingrained in our psyche. But we can change that story, and we have other rules and regulations that can reinforce a different type of story in the end. So moving beyond ownership, we started exploring some pillars around that: property as a practice of making kin, property as a verb, property as a practice of care, 7 generations of property. For instance, when we say the word people, I think many of us understand people as like people who are alive now. And I talked to a few indigenous people who were saying, for us, the word people involves necessarily past and future generations, not only people who are alive. And so rethinking what we mean also by certain words, property as a common. And I'll leave you on that quote from John Burroughs that he shared in a presentation near a pond in Toronto. Part of our challenge as peoples in cities is to learn how to live with the strength of the earth and draw this in a counseling fashion. Go talk to the trees and talk to the plants and understand their language, understand the stories, understand the science, understand the treaties of nature. And because it's living, it also means that it is not contained to a once upon a time in 1701. It means that what is happening today and what can happen in the future. And with Section 35, which is the recognition in the Constitution that I told you about as part of Canadian law, there's a way to help us start to make law not just in parliaments or legislatures or courts, but seeing law as being us and lawing together. It's not just lawyers and judges who practice law. We can all practice law, and we can do that by reconnecting people to their places. This is us. We don't have to wait for it. It's there. It's around us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was actually mind-blowingly brilliant. My phone is buzzing crazily because our team Slack channel is just going crazy and the chat is going crazy. And I think the reason for that is because what is so beautiful about the work that you've just presented out is a way of finding that space between so many different ideas. You know, the ideas laid out over these 6 days have been both from Indigenous leaders. We've got people like Raymond Snarrick talking about how to be a good ancestor. We've got practical projects in Winnipeg coming up. And then you have this talk from Indy, and to watch the way that your work is weaving and the nuance and the delicacy of, you know, even figuring out the right language around experimentation and all of that. It's absolutely incredible, because I want to make sure that we keep moving through. Yeah. Jonathan, if you can, I want to say thank you first of all and gratitude. If you answer some of those questions in the chat, or respond to people, that'd be wonderful. And I'm going to invite Carlotta onto the stage.
Okay.
And
thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was amazing, wasn't it? So much there.
Hello.
Hi, Carlotta. Lovely to see you. So I was just going to say that I know we're a little bit behind time, but stick to your time, and we'll move the schedule slightly. And very, very excited to welcome you and to hear more about the Trees as Infrastructure project. It's definitely given me so much food for thought in how you reframe so many different relationships we have in our city. So I'm going to leave you on the stage, and if you share your screen, and I'll go once you've shared your screen, and that's all okay.
Amazing. Thanks. And thanks, Jonathan. That was incredible. And Indy. All right.
Brilliant. Okay, take care.
Great. Cheers. Hello, everyone. I think just kind of taking a moment to breathe in and breathe out, because Jonathan's Jonathan work and the indigenous work they've been doing really paves the way through the project we have been working on the other side of the ocean, called Trees Infrastructure, which really tries to reimagine our relationship with our urban forests and cities, and how we can stimulate new practices to take care of ourselves and the ecosystem within it. And I think I want to start with kind of echoing Indy's talk and kind of Indy's introduction, looking at how the current crisis has really brought to the fore past crises as well. And this is an example of the Chicago heat waves. And how in this crisis we have really recognized how the requirement of creating different kind of ecosystems in our cities is so fundamental for our climate transition to be just and really distributed. And so things like the Victory Gardens that appeared in moment of crises, we've been seeing appearing during the lockdown crisis, but we ought to remember that perhaps the people that were growing their back gardens were not everyone, were the people that really had access to those back gardens. So how can we really change the way in which we develop our cities to enable everyone to be part of this shift? And this is the kind of provocation that we started, that kind of pushes us every day in developing this thinking. So the bad news, of course, is that we are not there yet, that we are falling short on all of the targets, both in the UK and the rest of the world. That we basically live in concrete slates and concrete jungle rather than living in sponges, in big sponges, as if as the places that we should actually be living in order to combat climate destruction. And that really a lot of the things that, a lot of the kind of moves in order to greenify, and some of the chats before were mentioning a few of the movements in the Netherlands and in France that allow people to really bring this kind of 50-50 that Jonathan was talking about within our cities are actually very difficult. In fact, 50% of our urban trees don't even make it to 10 years. However, we do know, and there is a massive movement, and I think Indy mentioned a few of these things, of people that around the world are trying to bring forward the evidence that this urban ecosystem, this urban forest, as we call it, which basically is everything from urban trees to back gardens to green roofs and facades and permeable surfaces, is actually much more than that, right? Actually, trees can be companions, they can be communities, they can be providers, expert witnesses, economies, data stories, and resourceful ancestors. And really, this has been evidenced from many, many different incredible scholars and scientists that have actually shown us how positive correlation between increasing canopy cover, which is essentially what the crown of trees, can correlate. 40% of this kind of increase can correlate to 2 degrees lower in the areas in which you have this increase in canopy cover. That these certain kind of trees can actually capture 60 to 70% of the rainfall that falls in kind of stormy days. And this essentially amounts to reduction in flooding damages, reduces the water runoff, and all of the kind of correlated costs that come into filtering this water and cleaning it and bringing it back into our taps. We know that green and tree-lined streets correlate to an incredible better amount of walkability, commercial area usages, but also they can bring incredible health benefits. And we know, for example, that elderly people can live 5 times as much, five additional years if they are placed in kind of urban forest ecosystem. That a patient in hospital is more likely to be discharged 1 day earlier if the view from the street is actually green, and that there is a very, very strong correlation, and this really echoes with Indy's introduction, a positive correlation between the increasing canopy cover and the reduction in antidepressants. And so all of this kind of information bundled together really tell us that trees are this kind of like, and the urban forest itself is this kind of powerful multi-servers which bring co-benefits to each of us. And I suppose the big point to remember is that if we consider the statistics I said before, that actually 50% of our trees die at their very young age, a lot of these benefits that I just went through, they don't even come to life, because what this diagram is showing you is that actually the urban forest can is able to be this witness and provider in the moment in which we let it grow and we let it become part of our cities, not just this kind of political one-off gesture. In fact, we know that unfortunately this is most of the time the case, that this is just a political gesture, that we treat our urban forests as a risk and not as a risk mitigator. And by this, I mean that a lot of our regulation, and this kind of echoes from Jonathan's talk, are there to say, for example, that our pavement need to be very neat and clean, because we shouldn't, they shouldn't act as this kind of a liability for people to kind of fall into a tree root and get damages on themselves. And therefore what we do is we try to kind of lower the risk by covering up our trees and by making regulation that do not allow the roots of the tree to actually breathe. So we compact them. And more than that, and the kind of core and most dysfunctional aspect of how we actually relate to our urban forests is that we account them as costs and not as assets. And some of you might remember the kind of debate and crisis in which in Sheffield very, very many elderly and very aged and ancient trees were cut down because essentially the procurement process was contracting for a number of trees to be planted, but it wasn't actually mentioning the quality and the typology of these trees, and therefore the contractor wasn't a bad person. It's just that it was much more efficient financially for him to cut down these big trees and put down small saplings. And all of that just because it was, our contracts are now preferential towards the lower bidder rather than towards the higher quality. And so currently what we do is when we don't account them as cost, we see them as essentially beautiful lampposts. So we see them for their amenity value, right? So we say, this is like good to have things, they're fluffy, they're beautiful, but actually in the moment in which crises occur, they are the first thing to be value engineered out. When that doesn't happen, which is something that maybe Jack might talk a little bit later on, is that a lot when we start to value what the tree is actually value to us, and you can see in this diagram, property value represents a very big chunk of this pie chart. And what that means is that a lot of the value and the provision given by this urban natural assets, they get captured back by land value, essentially. And so the value gets captured by landowner and therefore not being spread out equally. And so I want to go a level down and say, why does this happen? And we looked back at the kind of history of our, urban forests. And one goes back to 1896 in Massachusetts, in New England, when essentially the tree warden was awarded the ability to bring this amenity value back to our cities, and they started to define what these trees ought to look like and ought to behave and ought to be shaped, and they started defining the proper tree. So this really shows you how we relate to it as this kind of amenity object. And if you start looking, asking again, why was this the case, one might start to look at the amazing internationally renowned plant neurobiologist Stefano Mancuso, who has pointed out that actually in popular views, plants are essentially evolutionarily inferior. So when you start looking at even many very depictions of Noah's Ark, trees, plants, and seeds do not even appear. So while these are vital for humans, other species always were essentially valued, on a higher level. So this is when, and maybe we can have a chat later on. I want to shift the conversation from how much do you value tree to how much do trees value you? Because I think the dichotomy, nature, human is really a false one. Instead, building on Jonathan's chat, really we want to start thinking about, animate and inanimate. We want to start thinking about stones and trees and, all the objects around us as having a life of their own. So how do we do this? So we started working on trees as infrastructure as essentially a new ways of enabling a platform, and new ways of enabling different kind of value systems to come to bear into our urban forest management and financing. And this is starting to look at how we can use different kind of tools to enable us to do that. So essentially, kind of building on what was said before, we now are able to understand and to measure and to capture the value of the fact that 1,500 microgreen infrastructure plots are as powerful as a 1.5 million bond to essentially drain water. So you can imagine that the kind of shift between what a grey infrastructure is and what a green infrastructure is start to, the kind of dichotomy that we couldn't actually move towards a green infrastructure starts to fall apart, and we start to have the evidence and the ability to essentially demonstrate this. And so it's basically the ability of being able to do this from both a remote sensing tool and, most importantly, citizen sensing tool. So the ability to say, okay, this is not just a kind of technocratic shift, but it's really a cultural shift that is enabled by different kind of tool set. So we start to be able to have both the kind of bird's eye view ability to say, how do we transition from the cities in which we live right now, which, as you can see from the kind of central slide, are very much lacking, they're very kind of concrete slates, to the kind of 50-50 that we were mentioning earlier. Together with the ability of saying, okay, we now know that we can be agents of change from, the no more may that Jonathan mentioned, all the way to how do we digitize and make easier the droit de végétaliser, the ability to repave our street, to do it in the kind of easier way so that we don't have to essentially put barriers between the willingness and the agency of citizens and the kind of like top-down regulations. So secondly, we shift the way in which we can account trees. So the way in which we start to talk about the capturing of this value and the measuring of this value, as it was mentioned before, in this 1,500 microplots that can drain the water as powerfully as a 1.5 million bond sewage can, we can start to also see all the different sets of values that go beyond just argument of land value uplift, or go beyond a simple amenity value argument. And so we can start to see this kind of plethora of benefits and how we can start to account for all of them without being simplistic and without just having to bundle them. And so this can become tools essentially to predict the performance of this natural ecosystem in time, which is essentially what a lot of our current balance sheet are lacking, right? So the reason why a lot of the local authority are struggling to contract for outcomes is because their balance sheets and their budgets are yearly based, right? So they cannot, they would lose out if they told you, I put in now one and I know I'll get 100 in 10 years, but actually they cannot recoup that value. So how can we change the type of tools that we use in order to predict what that value will be, and then linking back to the right department in the local authority? And finally, how do we actually put in place the contracts and the micro contracts for the outcome or the missions, as you were saying, that can allow us to do that. And again, this is where some certain kind of tools can enable us to do so. So you lower essentially the high cost of transaction, the high cost of the legal fees, to be able to streamline some of these correlations. And this is building off some of the work that we've been building out of that Jonathan just mentioned, in seeing how from different kind of activities and different kind of actions, so how do we regenerate our urban forest, can then trickle up to different kind of beneficiaries and stakeholders, so that we are all enabled to essentially preventatively invest in our urban forests. And this goes from water utility companies, healthcare insurance companies, tenants, and developers themselves. So concluding, because I probably don't want to go too far, I think part of this kind of endeavor is really to see how we can create different kind of, and collectively empower ourselves to spread rather than just scale new management practices for taking care of our ecosystem and taking care of ourselves, that need to be triggered by change in incentives, technical tools, but most importantly, cultural beliefs. I might skip over this because we don't have so much time, but I think I just wanted to kind of conclude by quoting Gilles Clément, and essentially this understanding that planetary garden, it's not just someone who can sow or can plant, but someone who recognizes the need to protect and spread the requirement for this biodiversity. And we have seen popping out of everywhere around the world in different municipalities, movement that essentially show us that this is possible, that show us that, you know, in Melbourne, the municipality gave to each tree a tag so that citizens could say when the tree had a pest infection or was falling, and citizens started to send love letters to their favorite trees. In Copenhagen, 77,000 trees are now fruit trees. So they start to become not only this amenity value, but they start to become, you know, carers also for our subsistence. And yeah, I think this is everything. I just wanted to perhaps just conclude my last actual conclusion with Susan Zimmer, that many of you might have heard. She's an incredible forestry expert, and she's the amazing woman that enabled us to understand the incredible connection that occur below ground, and then enable forests to be as powerful and as essentially a cooperator as well as competitors. And so I encourage us, and this is the struggle that we're seeing every day, to see how we can recognize this interconnectedness within the values that are created by the urban forests. And once we recognize it, also force ourselves to kind of demolish those kind of inner constructions that enable us to value and share this value in a kind of networked way. So yeah, I think this is it for me. I will stop sharing. And sorry if I went on and it's just difficult to.
No problem at all, Carlotta. So first of all, thank you so much for that. There's actually quite a lot of writing and work online now about the trees as infrastructure project. So if you're fascinated even by like the early days of it, a lot of that's online. Please do go and check it out, and I'm sure Carlotta will stay in the chat as well. Thank you so much for your time on that, Carlotta. It's really thought-provoking work. I'm fascinated by it. Follow online and have a look at the videos and talks and all sorts of stuff that's from DML's Trees as Infrastructure project. Just to let everyone know, we've luckily, Alistair Parvin is part of the 00 family, so he's very happily moved his talk back half an hour. So we're going to be able to talk to Jack now for the next 20 minutes as planned. We'll have a little bit of time to wrap up, but I can see Jonathan chatting there as well. Carlotta will join, and we'll welcome Jack onto stage now. Thank you so much, Carlotta.
Thank you, Immy. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you. Awesome. Right. So trees as infrastructure is what you need to look up at the Dark Matter website, on Twitter, in the provocations. Oh, this is working incredibly smoothly, which I was very nervous about. So thank you so much, Jack. So Jack, please do take your full 20 minutes to talk through. So Jack's going to talk about Alt Camden and hopefully a little bit about Smart Commons work, which the Smart Commons work for me was just game changing, really. If you haven't read the Smart Commons first blog that's online, we'll put it in the chat. It's it's been foundational for me in understanding and highlighting how so much works in our cities. Jack's also going to talk about Alt Camden, which is about an institution for local experiments, alternative view of sidewalk, and we heard from Bianca Wiley last night, so you might hear some overlaps there as well. But yeah, thank you so much, Jack. Jack, are you going to be sharing your screen as well?
Yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. I'll stay on screen until you've shared your screen to check that works, and then I'll drop out. Enjoy, guys.
So can you see?
Yeah, that's perfect, Jack.
Full
See you.
screen?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Immy. Yeah, I mean, just serious thanks to Immy and the rest of the Civic Square team. It's amazing lineup and amazing kind of space to just air some of these thoughts that we've been working on internally as well, and also, touch in with a lot of the people who are working on this amazing stuff. So I'm going to keep it relatively short, I think. But yeah, as Immy suggested, checked in last night with the talk with Bianca, and obviously she's been working to try and create some resistance, I guess, against the latest venture of Sidewalk and Google, which was to try and build a city and create all the operating systems that a lot of us don't even know about or even kind of vaguely understand. And trying to bring that into public discourse, I think, was really laudable effort and really hard work, because a lot of us, when we talk about infrastructure and operating systems, we think immediately about the streets or how the roads work or how the telephone line works, but not a lot of us talk about, I guess, the digital operating system that is being kind of invented and privatized as we speak. So I guess this is just to touch on this idea of the kind of central point in this diagram, the model of ownership of the city and how it works and how it functions and how it can remain both accountable and legitimate. And I guess that's what kind of backed up Alt Camden as an idea and some of the evolving work that came out of it. It's also, you're going to hear some, I guess, from Alistair, but he kind of touches on this in some of his latest writing, which is where does the economy go next in terms of what it seeks to own, and what does that mean for how our cities are run and controlled, and how much accountability we have. So, like I said, Camden was really this idea, and it's a fairly abstract one, but to talk about governance in the sense of ownership. So who gets to decide how the rules are made, and that really has an effect on, I guess, how we feel about local place and how we feel about the agency we have about using spaces and how connected we are to local space. So that's kind of where Alt Camden came from, and the background to a lot of that work was a lot of the stuff that's already been touched on, but this kind of gigantic scale of challenge in front of us, which is this whole new set of urban commons that we're going to need. So when we look at some of the numbers around retrofitting, around reforestry, and kind of reconciling our past kind of destruction of some of this stuff, and also catering for potential growth that is likely to happen, both across, energy systems and transport. The kind of mind blows in terms of the scale and speed that we want to do it. So this is kind of a provocation in a sense to look at some of those underlying, as Indy talked about in his thing, look at those underlying risks and look at those massive challenges that we're also facing and what happens when we compound those, and how do we even start to make that a kind of on the ground conversation, or even start to translate that to people's everyday life or everyday concerns about the economy or about whatever. So a lot of this kind of came out, and we're trying to, of course, link those kind of on the ground issues with much more structural problems and make a kind of form a kind of identity and a purpose for a local institution, like a local group of something. So it remained a super abstract project to start with, but really it was kind of touching on these the accountability and inclusivity that the technology was kind of allowing us to interrogate, and this idea that somehow technology is this controlling factor, this something that shapes our destiny and our lives, and we somehow need to kind of question that as a whole model. So this is kind of, I guess, the tagline of some of the work, which is that your data does not equal your destiny, that we have agency over these things, and quite often they're not complicated systems that we're trying to create. They're incredibly simple, and they're shrouded in kind of mystery and confusion, as Bianca was also touching on a little bit last night. So a lot of this started with a kind of open invitation, and so a lot of this work was about trying to find the right message to invite people into this conversation, which is often kind of big and scary. The kind of background of this thing is really, we talk about, and as Jonathan touched on, environmental destruction as a kind of result of extraction and an extractive economy. And we also have the same thing with an information economy. Amazing book if you've not had the chance to read it, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Shoshana Zuboff really sums this up pretty well, that industrial society thrived at the expense of the environment, and information society thrives at the expense of human nature, through a kind of control and extraction of human behavior and trying to predict that into the future. And we're kind of seeing that play out now. So, Immy, your concerns that you raised yesterday about like, what does this even mean at these operating systems of crisis response, and how do we even challenge them? Is this right? Is this useful? I mean, they might know what they're doing, so maybe we should leave them to it. There's this kind of idea that we can't even engage with this as a topic. So trying to wrap this up and trying to kind of look at how do we start experimenting with a new economy in a kind of local level? What are the kind of key focusing elements that we want to kind of base this on? So we decided to kind of narrow it down through some kind of public workshops and some engagement to these three kind of sections of what we want to kind of stand for and start to prototype stuff around data rights and really nailing into some of the kind of regulations and rules and governance models of physical space. Obviously looking at how, when we talk about the scale of retrofitting needed, it's something like 50,000 houses a day across Europe for the next 30 years, which just blows the mind in terms of how do we even start with that conversation, and what does that mean for the institution that might be tasked to do that sort of work. Obviously that links into the other stuff, which actually, if we reframe this as less of a kind of centralized control model of like how fast can we renovate the city, or how quickly can we make the city efficiently run through various new bits of platforms and tech, and actually we reframe that as a way, as an opportunity to design new ways of inclusion and justice into the operating system of the stuff we're going to invent. And so really this kind of tries to reframe stuff less from a like finding the perfect startup and trying to hunt down the unicorn, and really look at how do we host a system of innovation across a neighborhood, and really holding these two things in parallel. The stuff that people kind of immediately get and respond to, which is like, how does my physical space change? And also, what is the kind of operating system that sits underneath that is repurposing some of that physical infrastructure? And so, yeah, we kind of try to reframe some of this stuff in bigger kind of narrative works, running through, I guess, this idea of the stack and what we need to kind of address. This is really the kind of core of some of the boring revolution, the attempt to reframe bureaucracy. And we also worked with some partners on the ground. We worked with the Camden Town Unlimited Business Improvement District, which was really looking at what are local institutions that already have accountability, that already have relationships on the ground, that already have a kind of a network to kind of activate some of this thinking, some of this work, and how does it evolve? Or how can we repurpose some of these kind of local institutions that are already up instead of trying to start a new one? So it's really looking at the business improvement district, which has a kind of, in Camden, they've been focusing a lot on repurposing, meanwhile space, providing affordable workspace. They're even looking into like how they can build affordable housing, and they really see themselves as leveraging money at the local level to kind of extend their mandate. So this was a kind of obvious next step for them, and working with us as well. So we looked at, I guess, a kind of theory of, or kind of overview of transition. The first stage being that we need this kind of platform. We need ideas and experiments to be able to test stuff in real life. So a lot of this, was hosted through workshops, trying to come up with ideas, putting these ideas on the table, really getting stuff to think about. So there's a kind of couple of workshops where we ran through some of this stuff and fed it back, and we started publishing stuff. And out of that, we kind of narrowed it down on the day to narrowed it down to kind of 30 potential experiments, which we're really looking at, I guess, how do we tie these everyday issues of housing affordability, really hard to get into really hard to get a job, or the kind of the changing nature of the job market with things like Uber and Deliveroo and Just Eat. How do we kind of address some of those issues through I guess, some strategic experiments? And we came up with this model, which was really about trying to say, okay, what is this platform that we need? And this kind of initiating thing, and how does it relate to local space? So starting off with this idea of like, okay, we need a team, we need a hub, we need somewhere to base this thing, but we also need like hardware, in a sense, like actual space, but also we need some data infrastructure that we can play with, and it can also be open, and new ways of making that accountable. And so one of the ideas that came out of it, I mean, this was actually interesting to see this kind of starting to happen now in response to COVID for whole different reasons. But this was done at some point last year. We're really looking at like, what is the mechanism that governs the road? And when we look at this space now, we've seen the space of the road empty and kind of starting to be repurposed. And you look at it and you question, like, how do I use that space? How can I use it if I'm not using a car? And what else could it host? And what are the other benefits I can get from it? So we looked at the idea of temporary road closures and licenses, and the process that you have to go through that. And you have to fill out about 6 different forms, and there's all sorts of biases in how you fill those forms out, the words you use, the events you start to say, and starting to interrogate some of that stuff, and really trying to make that kind of thing simple as a way to transition our thinking around streets. Obviously, this has a whole new resonance now, as I said. So, how do you then feed that back into something that people can kind of understand and get involved with, right? Because what we're talking about is a kind of operating system of how the bureaucracy of how we get permission to use space. But actually, we should reframe that. And if we talk about how government can or institutions can start to increase their level of transparency and trust with citizens, it will be about reframing how do we get permission to actually the invitation to be able to use some of that stuff. So what do you want to do with the street if you're not going to drive on it, and kind of what's the operating system that makes that possible or easy or not kind of burden on the behalf of the public sector. Another experiment that came out of this, which is part of the Smart Commons work, which was really looking into kind of the effects of when you spend public money in space to be able to upgrade it. So let's say we're pedestrianizing a street or planting a lot of trees or making a park, how does that change the nature of the economy next to you, and what does it mean for the housing? Often, so this was obviously done in the context of Camden. The project was based in Camden. They had this project which was about the Camden High Line, taking an old railway, turning it into a public park and connecting some of the streets and parks that already exist in Camden. Now, obviously, when you do these kind of things, when you fund them, the house prices next to this new lovely park go up, right? And often this provides a kind of excuse for like property developers who want to develop in the area to give a little bit of money to these public goods, because then the kind of open secret of all this is that they create value, and they will kind of push up and gentrify some of this stuff. Now, obviously, this park, if we then put that into context of the climate transition, some of the trees work that Carlotta was talking about, we're talking about huge scale transitions to stuff that is probably going to be more green, more walkable, more local, all the stuff that we know kind of adds value because it is that public value that we're creating, both in lifestyle and in the physical environment. So the original idea for this obviously comes from the High Line in New York. So this is a map of Manhattan where we then looked at historical property prices and how that changed when the High Line was built. And this is known as the High Line effect. So we kind of tried to map some of this stuff out, and obviously tried to then correlate the difference between the area of how much it had gone up and whether there was a kind of link we could prove. Because we know, it's a kind of open secret, but we can't. As soon as we kind of put data to it and can map it, can see it, then it kind of changes how we look at public goods like parks and like public investment. And so what we found was the project cost 187 million, which is mostly paid for by public money. They created a huge amount of wealth in the neighboring property, which is massive in comparison to how much it cost. But the resultant kind of ways of, let's say, clawing, the kind of traditional model of clawing back some of that value didn't even cover the project cost. So we're talking about huge amounts of value being created, and knowing that it's created, being able to see it and map is a completely different thing. So we looked at, okay, how do we then reframe the contract so that actually we can pool some of that land value, so that we're not relying on speculative investors to come buy up land, build a load of flats, sell them for prices we can't afford? How do we actually reframe that as a possibility for people that are already living there, to be able to make choices about their local area, how it gets improved, what they want to see being improved? So looked at making a contract with each house and whether that was possible and what sort of data we'd need to do that, and really trying to reframe the idea of where the value of public goods is accrued and where it can be collected and comes from. So this idea of a kind of carbon covenant, which is an old legal mechanism to kind of do some of this stuff. What would an updated digital version of this be? And really, how does that change the nature of the property contract? Again, it's these kind of responsibilities and rights that Jonathan was talking about. Technology allows us to understand where the value is flowing in a geographic area, and it allows us to reframe our traditional notion of property, so we can start to think about the responsibilities rather than just the things we get from it, like the money having lived there for 5-10 years. And so we can start to really think about making climate transition slightly more democratic, and we can open up that conversation in much more local and interesting ways. And so we've been experimenting a little bit with, like, how can we apply those to things that we know we need to do? So can we make contracts for energy savings, for retrofit contracts? And is that a way of, as soon as we can provide a trustable, transparent model of doing that, can you leverage other pots of money from, say, the NHS or healthcare benefits that you might get down the line? And yeah, again, really always focusing on how do we democratize that public investment, which is usually done from a very large-scale view, looking at the whole country and saying, okay, we need some more innovation. Well, that innovation is going to be in AI and like robots to help the elderly. And so actually we can start to talk about much more nuanced ways, because we can understand the value flows at much more local level and give people a chance to participate in understanding where that value goes. So we can start to talk about all the things that we sort of might want to see in the local area, like local food produce or new local green space or trees, in a way that doesn't just immediately jack up the immediate property price and gentrify the area that you're currently living in. So in a way, it's, I guess, this effort to explore and very much in the kind of exploration phase of this stuff, making the climate transition more democratic. So how can we use technology in a much kind of more open, democratic way to reframe neighborhoods as really a kind of piece of living infrastructure that is a kind of supporting mechanism that invests in human development, human agency, rather than as we've seen with property rises, I think actually detract and extract from that. And that's it. That's the end. I put some questions here which were kind of half from the chat, but also half my thinking, like these new, how do we fund some of these institutions? What sort of institutions can we adapt and evolve at local level, and how do we kind of make that political narrative and link up the kind of everyday stuff we talk about with potentially some of these more systemic stuff?
Thank you so much, Jack. We're going to attempt for everyone to come back on stage in a second. We're going to attempt it. Let's see what happens. It might just crash the whole platform. But I want to say thank you so much, and also to those of you who are thinking about what especially Jack's talk might mean, please do check out the Smart Commons first long read that's online, because I think it was such an important bridge between like our dreams at a local level to build civic infrastructure, and then actually understanding the problem and understanding what actually happens with value as it's captured in the wrong places and not reinvested back into creating more sustainable finance mechanisms locally. So I would really strongly recommend you read that. And Jack, thanks so much for sharing. Again, Alt Camden is on the site, and there's on the website, and you can read more about that. So I'm going to invite everyone back on the stage and say, first of all, a huge thank you. Before I'm going to ask you for your kind of like closing thoughts. I think if we get into questions, we'll be here for a few hours, and Alistair definitely won't forgive you because he's already moved his talk back half an hour for us to be able to do this. But I want to say thank you first of all, because I think what I'm fascinated by is the chain of like work over the last 6 or 7 years. There's lots of people in the chat who I know have heard either Indy or combinations of you guys talk, and just to watch that continual turning of the theory, the thesis, and that continual state of experimentation or possibilities, and the way you're working, sharing, and as Indy said, might not be getting it perfect yet in terms of what an organisation looks like, but the commitment to continue working on that. I am fascinated by the mission contracts and things like that, and I know that we had loads of people in the chat who said that. So instead of kind of asking you questions, because we'll be here for forever, I'm going to kind of ask you to either close with maybe a call to action, a question that you'd want people to deeply reflect on. Really paramount as we move out of this time together. And yeah, thank you so much for the time that you've taken. I don't know whether I just cut off a little bit there, but I'm just going to repeat. These guys are going to hopefully leave you with a closing question, call to action, or future vision that I want you to contemplate on. And I think we can go maybe
Is she coming back, or?
I don't know. Okay, Jack, do you want to kick us off, or Jonathan, do you want to kick us off with a call for action?
I guess, you haven't presented in details the different horizons of long emergency that we've been working on, but there was a strong focus on, shifting from the age of enlightenment to the age of entanglement and getting ready to plan for unknown risks and unknowable risks. And I feel like with the discussions around race at the moment and with the work that we've done with some indigenous people, where I needed to re-listen so many times to the same thing to really grasp what they were saying, because I had so not been exposed to that. I guess all of this, I think we need to, recognize and operate from a standpoint that we ignore a lot more than we know, and we're here to get it right, not be right, and being uncomfortable with being wrong and being uncomfortable because it's uncomfortable sometimes in a society that is based on knowledge and where knowledge is power. And it's, I think it will continue to be a struggle, but yeah, that's what I felt like sharing. And by the way, we are here to get it right, not be right. I heard that last week on Brené Brown's podcast, Unlocking Us, and I thought it was a great quote.
Thanks, Jonathan. Sorry, guys, I think my internet melted down with this many brains coming into my computer. So thank you, Jonathan. But yeah, just go around and closing reflection or question or something that you want the audience to ponder on as we move out of your session in the Department of Dreams.
Maybe I'll just conclude on my bit, and thanks again, Immy and the whole team for doing this. And I think I would just encourage everyone to take care of themselves in the process of doing this, because I've just been off of a week of dark matter. I just moved back to Italy, my hometown, and just listening back to all of this, the amazing setup, lineup that you created in me, I was just, my mind almost blew up myself. And I think it's just the, making change doesn't happen if we all burn out. So that would be my conclusion. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I'll let you go have the last word, Indy. But yeah, I mean, fully echo what Jonathan and Carlotta is saying. I think, yeah, that kind of license to know that you're not going to get it right at all, and you're going to need to open all of this conversation up in order to kind of learn yourself and relearn some of the stuff in order to kind of progress some of the stuff. But I guess, at this stage, we just have to keep believing that some better world is possible and that we're in the early stages of building that. Because if we let go of that, then we're going to find ourselves in a dark space, I think. So just keeping the faith, keeping the hope, and giving yourself the time to kind of nurture that, I think, is super important.
So, Jack, I wasn't going last because I just didn't know what to say. So I was buying time more than anything else. Actually, and I think something you said just triggered me in the right way. Yesterday I was on a call, and it was really interesting. There was a sort of very, I think, relatively famous gentleman philosopher who was in his elder years. And he was talking about the future, and he was talking about the future in the sense of it already having failed. His language and positioning with great authority, with great intellectual authority and position, pretty smart man, was basically predicating a future where actually it's failed. And we need to return to localism and grow our own local food because that's the only way we're going to survive. And the scenario, and it wasn't done consciously, it was almost, this is the de facto truth. And I really struggled with that. And it's your point about if we give up. And if we give up both in terms of language or we fall victim to the past dependencies people are laying out for us. I think that really worried me. And I had to pull him back. Who am I? But I had to pull him back and say that's a scenario. But if we go to that scenario, I think humans have released the nuclear bombs around the world. By the time we've got there, it's not like a quaint localism that we think is like, oh, it's all lovely now. A whole bunch of other stuff has already happened, which you're ignoring. And I think it's really important that we start to acknowledge that it's really that these are multiple futures that sit in front of us, and there are choices, and choices of what narratives we permit, choices of what narratives we link up to. And I also think there's a responsibility to recognize these are A scenarios. These aren't universal futures. They aren't path-dependent futures. We sit at the precipice of a multitude of futures, and every choice has to give that opportunity. So I think that was one of the things that I really did strike me, that we must be conscious that we're not led by the notion of the future is done, and release our power into that process. The future is not done. The future is to be discovered, and to be discovered in relationship with the future and future citizens. So I think it's really important that we retain some form of agency in relationship to that. And that's my kind of number one feeling. But we also have to be declarative about our intent. So the kind of declaration is really critical. So it isn't an invisible thesis of control either.
Thank you, Indy. Thank you, everyone. Just loads of practical, visionary, experimental possibilities, honesty, truths, darkness, humility. I really appreciate it. I appreciate it because I think the whole of all those combinations of dark matter over the years have meant that, you know, we're both honest about the threats ahead, and so we can actually kind of try and open our eyes to the scale, but we're hopeful and practical. And as Margaret said this morning, you know, the road ahead is paved by walking, right? You have to make the road. It's not go and find the road. You've got to make it. And I think, you know, with what Indy just said, we can't give up. I really appreciate everyone there's loads of people in this session and online. It's been great. I really enjoy it, and I have like absolute daily proximity to this work. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I was thinking earlier about in Punjabi and Sikhi, we have this term where we, at the end of everything we do at the Gurdwara, we'll say a term called Bhul Chuk Maaf, which means for anything I've got wrong, please, please accept that, you know, it wasn't intentional. And I've been thinking about this the last 3 days with so many talks and so many different views, and, you know, and the warm, beautiful spirit of the collective hosting on here. That came to my mind this morning. So I wanted to share it because I think I wanted to say thank you for the open minds that you're coming to all the different talks and ideas, and don't look for answers, just look for bits where you can weave together different parts of stories and different parts of what you need right now. That's the reprovocation, right? What do you need? You might be in a stage where you need to get out and throw statues off into the water. You might need to be resting. You might need to be redesigning. You might need to be in all these different spaces. So take what you can, save what you need for the future. And thank you so much for the generosity of time and knowledge and all of the work from Dark Matter.